Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going on a bit of a historical detective hunt. We're looking at how scholars have spent literally decades trying to decode the truth about Stalinism. It's a fascinating story, not just about history itself, but about the actual people who write it, the deeply buried secrets they uncover, and how our view of the past is just constantly shifting. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll move chronologically, starting with the immediate post-war critiques, navigating our way through the fierce debates of the Cold War, and then finally unlocking the massive discoveries made possible by the opening of the Soviet archives. All right, part one, the puzzle of Stalinism. Let's look at the core challenge historians actually face when analyzing this highly secretive era. Seriously, how do historians make sense of a regime like Stalin's? Imagine trying to solve a giant puzzle where, well, half the pieces are hidden behind an iron curtain. For decades, historians were essentially operating in the dark. Without reliable documents, they had to rely on public propaganda, accounts from defectors, and, honestly, a whole lot of deduction. The core challenge here is separating myth from fact across totally different eras of access and ideology. History isn't static, right? Our understanding shifts based entirely on who is holding the magnifying glass and what documents they actually get to look at. Separating state-sponsored myth from hard fact is incredibly tough, especially since it's heavily colored by the politics of the era the historian is writing in. Moving on to part two, Koffler's critique of bureaucracy. Let's see how this plays out by looking through the eyes of an incredibly insightful Marxist dissident, Leo Koffler. Now, Koffler's theories were forged in a really harsh reality. He actually began as an Austrian Marxist back in the 1920s, but by 1938, he was forced to flee fascism and go to Switzerland. After the war, he moved to early East Germany, full of socialist hope. But his critical thinking made him an immediate target of the new Stalinist system, and he was forced to flee for his life once again in 1950, ending up in West Germany. So, based on all that, Koffler didn't view the power structure he escaped as true Marxism. He coined this term, socialist bureaucracy. To him, it wasn't Marxist at all. It was a dogmatic, anti-humanist tool. He argued that a new intellectual elite was using the ideology merely as a way to legitimize their grip on power, completely stripping away the humanist core of the original philosophy. But his most profound observation was actually about the people inside that machine. He noted that the leading layers of this bureaucracy consisted of devoted, self-sacrificing idealists. They didn't subjectively seem like mere privilege writers. And that's the kicker. This bureaucracy didn't just survive on terror alone. It thrived because its functionaries suffered from massive self-deception. They genuinely viewed themselves as serving a historical necessity, not just being cynical opportunists. And that genuine belief made the regime's ideological grip terrifyingly strong. All right, part three, the revisionist history movement. Let's fast forward to the 1970s and 80s, where Western academia experiences a massive methodological earthquake. For years, what we call the totalitarian model totally dominated. This was a top-down approach focused strictly on political science, state power, and terror. But then a new generation, the revisionists, kind of flipped the script. They introduced a bottom-up approach. They pivoted to social history, focusing on everyday life in society, basically asking what was actually happening on the ground. Revisionist scholars like Sheila Fitzpatrick zoomed right in on that everyday life. They tracked things like how rapid industrialization created new social mobility and education, while simultaneously uncovering fierce peasant resistance to collectivization. They even studied how ordinary citizens used denunciations against each other from below. But surprisingly, simply looking at these societal realities rather than focusing purely on the top-down terror earned these historians a fierce Cold War backlash. People actually accused them of being regime apologists just for changing the academic lens. Now for part four. Opening the Soviet archives. Because in the 1990s, the academic landscape was about to be turned completely upside down. So the collapse of the USSR in 1991 triggered what historians called the archive revolution. Suddenly, the massive declassification of Soviet state archives happened. Scholars literally walked right into the vault. They gained unprecedented, direct access to millions of highly classified state and police documents. And for the very first time, international historians could synthesize cold, hard new facts directly from the source. It was a huge deal. But, and here is the fascinating paradox, while the archives provided a ton of facts, they didn't automatically solve the debate over the nature of Stalinism. Archives, as it turns out, aren't perfectly organized storybooks. They are massive, messy mountains of bureaucratic paperwork. Historians now had millions of new clues, but the meaning of those clues was still fiercely contested. Which brings us to part 5, comparing modern biographies. Let's look at exactly how modern historians are dealing with those messy archives today. Take two monumental modern biographies by Oleg Khlevniuk and Stephen Kotkin. They are looking at the exact same man using the exact same archives, but taking wildly different approaches. Khlevniuk restricts himself only to the most highly reliable archival sources, and he focuses tightly on Stalin's individual guilt and psychology. Kotkin, on the other hand, zooms out. He blends the individual with a grand global history, and he's willing to use a much wider, diverse mix of sources. And when it comes to Lenin's relationship with Stalin, Khlevniuk sees a complete breakdown, while Kotkin views Lenin as harmoniously promoting Stalin. They even fiercely debate the very documents they uncover. Take Lenin's famous secret testament, warning the party against Stalin. Khlevniuk's view is that this proves a deep, irreconcilable conflict between the two leaders. But Kotkin's view? He controversially argues the document was a complete forgery, meant to pressure Stalin, and that Lenin actually continuously promoted him right to the very end. It just goes to show that even with the archives wide open, history is still a living, breathing, and highly active debate. Yet, despite those totally different methods and clashing interpretations, both authors arrive at one undeniable, shared conclusion. The archives prove that Stalin was an absolute master at continuously dividing his enemies and his allies. He had an unmatched, terrifying genius for manipulation to consolidate absolute power. On that, they absolutely agree. Ultimately, history is never just a static textbook. From Koffler's philosophical critiques back in the 50s, to the revisionist push of the 80s, to the massive archival revolutions happening right now, our lens is just constantly shifting. As new archives open and new generations reflect, it leaves us with one provocative question: how will the history of Stalinism be rewritten next? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the past, and we'll catch you next time.